In August 1915, under the blazing Mediterranean sun, the Gallipoli Peninsula became a landscape of desperation and confusion. The Allied campaign, an ambitious attempt to open the Dardanelles Strait and strike directly at the Ottoman heartland, had already descended into chaos. By midsummer, the beaches at Suvla Bay were choked with men, supplies, and uncertainty. Among them stood the 1/5th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment, a unit drawn mostly from the quiet farmlands and estates of eastern England. Many of these men were Sandringham boys, workers from the royal estate itself, led by Lieutenant Colonel Sir Horace Proctor Beauchamp. They were ordinary men, many volunteers, thrust into an extraordinary and unforgiving theatre of war. By August 12th, morale was fraying. The heat was relentless, water scarce, and command structures stretched thin. Orders were unclear. Attacks planned on maps in London bore little resemblance to the tangled scrub and jagged ravines that defined Gallipoli's terrain. Yet that morning, at around 4 p.m., the 163rd Brigade received a direct order: advance east from Suvla Bay toward the ridge near Anafarta. Their mission was simple in wording but impossible in execution: push back entrenched Ottoman forces and secure the high ground. The Norfolk men began their climb. Rifle fire cracked through the air as the battalion moved through the olive groves. The sun dipped low, painting the horizon in a dusty gold haze. The advance, slow and disjointed, quickly lost contact with the supporting battalions. Witnesses from the 1/4th Norfolks later recalled how the 1/5th pressed ahead, ignoring the cries to fall back or regroup. They were swallowed by the smoke, one survivor wrote in a letter home. It was as if the land itself took them. Amidst the chaos, communication broke down entirely. The radios were silent, field telephones useless in the rocky terrain. From the Allied lines, all that could be seen was a cloud of dust and drifting gun smoke obscuring the battalion's path. Some officers assumed they had reached the Ottoman trenches. Others feared they had overextended and been cut off. But when the guns quieted that evening, there was nothing. No movement, no returning men, not even the echo of rifle fire. Back at headquarters, confusion turned quickly to disbelief. Reports from aerial reconnaissance failed to locate any sign of the battalion. Commanders speculated that they had been decimated by machine gun fire or ambushed in the gullies. Yet, curiously, no mass casualties were found where they should have fallen. Even the Ottoman defenders, when interrogated later, denied capturing or killing such a large group in that sector. Colonel Beauchamp and his men, 267 strong, were listed as missing in action. For their families back in Norfolk, the telegrams that arrived in late August were vague and devastating. "Your son is missing," they read, with no further explanation. In the small villages of Sandringham, letters were pinned to church doors, prayers said for men who had vanished without a trace. The king himself, whose estate had lost many workers in the unit, expressed personal sorrow and confusion over their fate. War correspondents and officers alike began to speculate. Some said the men had advanced too far and were captured. Others whispered that a sudden counterattack had driven them into the sea. But none of these accounts fit the evidence, or lack thereof. There were no prisoners reported, no mass graves uncovered, no credible eyewitness testimony that could explain how an entire battalion simply ceased to exist. The few survivors who straggled back days later offered little clarity. Exhausted and delirious, they recalled marching forward into a dense haze, then nothing more. One soldier described hearing a sound like thunder before waking up alone amid the scrub. Another claimed to have seen the battalion's colours still flying as they disappeared over the rise. What happened next would become one of the most confounding mysteries of the Gallipoli campaign. Over the coming months, British command quietly suppressed discussion of the incident, classifying the battalion as presumed killed in action. But the truth was far less certain. No battlefield report, no intelligence summary, and no post-action assessment ever satisfactorily explained their fate. The hills above Suvla Bay remained eerily silent in the aftermath. The Norfolks had marched into history and into legend. The few who had watched them go could only repeat the same haunting refrain. They advanced and never returned. As the smoke cleared and the campaign dragged on, whispers of the vanished men began to circulate among the ranks. Some called it a tragedy of command, others a riddle of war. But for the families waiting across the sea, the unanswered question was simple and painful. Where did they go? And so began an investigation that would span decades. a search not only for the lost battalion, but for the truth buried beneath the sands of Gallipoli. By the time the sun rose on August 13, 1915, confusion had taken root across the Allied front at Suvla Bay. The 1/5th Norfolk Battalion had vanished, swallowed by the chaos of battle, the blinding dust and the unforgiving landscape of Gallipoli. Officers scoured the ridgelines through field glasses, searching for any sign of movement, any trace of their men. What they saw instead was a heavy, rolling mist creeping low over the valley, a natural fog perhaps, but one that seemed strangely persistent amid the arid heat. Nearby units of the 163rd Brigade reported conflicting accounts. Men of the 1/4th Norfolks, positioned slightly to the west, later told military investigators that they had seen the 1/5th moving steadily forward into a bank of smoke or cloud. It was not unusual. Artillery. Fire often raised thick plumes, but what unsettled the witnesses was what came next. The smoke did not disperse. Instead, it hung low over the ridge as the entire battalion disappeared within it and never emerged again. No gunfire followed. No wounded crawled back, just silence. At headquarters, Brigadier General Beauchamp-Doran struggled to make sense of the reports. "The 1/5th Norfolks are missing," he wrote tersely in his field diary, "presumed cut off or destroyed." But behind that simple statement lay an air of disbelief. If the men had been slaughtered, their bodies should have been visible once the smoke cleared. If they had been captured, the Ottoman records should have reflected it. Yet both sides, British and Turkish alike, remained equally puzzled. In the days that followed, search parties were sent out under cover of darkness. They combed the gullies and ravines north of Anafata, calling out into the still night, rifles slung low, bayonets glinting in the moonlight. They found nothing. No wounded men, no rifles, no regimental colours. One patrol stumbled upon a small scattering of discarded equipment, canteens, a torn haversack, but no signs of struggle. It was as if the battalion had been lifted out of the landscape altogether. Then came the rumours. Word spread quickly through the ranks. The Sandringham Battalion had marched into the fog and vanished. Some said the Turks had laid an ambush and buried the dead to conceal the evidence. Others whispered that the men had defected or been taken to secret labour camps deep inside Anatolia. The more plausible explanation, that poor communication and confusion had led them astray, was the least satisfying. How could more than 200 men, led by seasoned officers, simply walk off the map? Military intelligence dispatched aerial observers to search from above. Pilots flying primitive reconnaissance biplanes surveyed the ridges, snapping grainy photographs of the landscape. The results were inconclusive. From the air, the land looked pockmarked and lifeless. Craters, trenches, and the faint outline of abandoned camps. No trace of a lost battalion. Back home in England, the news filtered through slowly. The Eastern Daily Press carried a short notice in September. Men of the Sandringham Company, missing since August engagement. But for families across Norfolk, the notice only deepened their grief. Letters arrived from the War Office, cold, bureaucratic condolences. "Regret to inform you that your son is missing in action. Further details will be forwarded when known." None ever came. In private correspondence between officers, the tone shifted from confusion to quiet alarm. A memo from Major General Frederick Stopford, commander at Suvla, remarked on the strangeness of the event. "There is no reasonable explanation for their disappearance," he wrote, and yet it occurred before the eyes of 2 brigades. The mystery began to grow beyond the battlefield. It was discussed in officers' messes, in field hospitals, even among war correspondents looking for stories to send home. The Ottoman command, when questioned through intermediaries after the campaign, offered no answers. Turkish officers too claimed ignorance. Some stated they had seen no large engagement in that sector at all on the day the Norfolks vanished. For the first time, both sides of a brutal war were united in confusion. As the campaign ground on, the Gallipoli operation became a byword for futility. Disease, heat, and mismanagement claimed more lives than bullets. But even among the countless tragedies of that doomed venture, the loss of the 1/5th Norfolk Battalion stood apart, an absence that defied the logic of war. "Men do not simply vanish," remarked one intelligence officer years later. Yet vanish they did. The legend began to take shape, whispered first among soldiers, then reported by journalists after the war. Some accounts exaggerated the conditions, speaking of a white mist that consumed the men. a tale repeated by a New Zealand engineer years later at a veterans' reunion. He swore he had seen the Norfolks walk into a strange cloud, shining like silver in the sunlight, never to reappear. Whether born of imagination, memory, or trauma, his story added to the mythic aura surrounding the lost battalion. By the end of 1915, the Gallipoli evacuation had begun. The beaches that once swarmed with life fell eerily silent. Yet one absence hung heavier than all the others. Somewhere among the ridges of Anafata lay the truth of what happened to those men. But until the ground itself yielded its secrets, the world could only wonder. The war moved on, the maps changed, and new battles were fought, but the question lingered, echoing across time and memory. How can an entire battalion disappear in plain sight? By early 1919, 4 years after the guns fell silent on the Gallipoli Peninsula, the British government began the solemn task of accounting for the missing. Thousands of men from across the empire lay unburied or unidentified, their names etched into casualty lists and memorials that spanned continents. Among them, the disappearance of the 1/5 Norfolk Battalion remained one of the most perplexing mysteries of the entire campaign. When the Imperial War Graves Commission dispatched recovery teams to the former battlefields, they carried orders to find any trace of the Sandringham Battalion and finally close a chapter that had haunted both the military and the families of Norfolk. The landscape they encountered was barren and hostile, a place where time had stood still. Rusted helmets half buried in sand, fragments of rifles jutting from the earth, and the occasional sun-bleached bone told the story of men who had fought and fallen far from home. The team, led by Captain Leslie O'Neill of the Graves Registration Unit, began its search near the Anafata Ridge, the very ground where the battalion had last been seen advancing in August 1915. For days, they found nothing but silence and the occasional trace of long-forgotten skirmishes. Then, on one blistering afternoon, they made a discovery that would reignite the mystery. Scattered across a dried riverbed, hidden by thickets of scrub and rock, lay the remains of dozens of British soldiers. Torn uniforms still bore the insignia of the Norfolk Regiment. Faded, but unmistakable. O'Neill recorded the find in his report. The remains of 122 men discovered in ravine approximately 800 yards beyond Allied lines, believed to be elements of the 1/5 Norfolk Battalion. Yet the report raised more questions than it answered. The position of the bodies suggested that the men had advanced far beyond their intended objective, deeper into Ottoman-held territory than any official map had indicated. The skeletal remains were found in tight clusters, as though the men had fallen together under concentrated fire. Yet no defensive positions, no bullet casings, and no signs of enemy encampments surrounded them. Equally strange was the lack of Ottoman graves nearby. It appeared to be a one-sided tragedy. Among the dead was an officer's body, later identified through personal effects as Lieutenant Colonel Sir Horace Beauchamp. His identification disc, bent and blackened, was returned to England with the simple note, "Recovered from position unknown, near Anafata." When word of the discovery reached Britain, it was met with both relief and disbelief. After 4 years of silence, families finally had confirmation that their loved ones had not been captured or spirited away. They had died in battle. But the location of their deaths, nearly a mile beyond the expected line of advance, deepened the mystery. How had they reached so far into enemy territory without support? Who had ordered the advance beyond the ridge? And why had no Ottoman units claimed responsibility for engaging them? In the quiet Norfolk countryside, where many of the men had once worked the Royal Estates fields, the news arrived like an echo of grief long delayed. In Sandringham Church, a memorial service was held for the fallen. King George IV himself attended, paying tribute to the men who had marched from his estate and never returned. Yet even he is said to have remarked privately on the strangeness of their fate. A tragedy, yes, but one that seemed to resist explanation. The War Office, eager to avoid further speculation, issued a brief and carefully worded statement. The men of the 1/5 Norfolk Regiment fought bravely in the advance at Suvla Bay and were killed in action. Their remains have been recovered and will be interred with honour. But among the ranks of veterans and surviving officers, quiet doubts persisted. If the battalion had been destroyed in open combat, why had no reports surfaced from either side at the time? Why had it taken 4 years for their remains to be discovered in such a concentrated area? And what of the accounts from nearby brigades? Of men marching into an unnatural haze and vanishing? Researchers who later examined O'Neill's field notes found peculiar omissions. The report mentioned no cause of death, no ballistic evidence, and no corresponding Ottoman losses. Some suggested the men had been caught in a sudden counterattack and trapped in a ravine as artillery rained down upon them. Others proposed they had advanced under a misinterpreted order, outflanking their own lines until they were isolated and overrun. But without physical evidence, these remained theories. Patchwork explanations for what remained one of the most haunting disappearances in modern military history. As the bodies were laid to rest in collective graves under the blazing Gallipoli sun, the soldiers' names were finally inscribed in stone. Yet for every name carved into the Helles memorial, there lingered a sense of incompletion, a story half told, half understood. The official record declared the matter closed, but the mystery refused to fade. And as the decades passed, whispers persisted among historians and veterans alike. Had the disappearance of the Norfolk Battalion been merely the fog of war, or something far more deliberate? A tragedy of command, perhaps, quietly buried under layers of official silence? The answers, it seemed, still lay hidden in the dry earth of Gallipoli, waiting for someone to uncover them. As the 1920s unfolded, the Great War's battlefield slowly gave way to silence. Grass crept over trenches, shell holes filled with rainwater, and the scars of war began to fade, except for the questions that refused to die. Among them, the riddle of the vanished battalion lingered in military circles and newspaper columns alike. When the War Office officially closed its files on the 1/5th Norfolk Regiment, the mystery only deepened. What had truly happened in that August assault on Anafarta Ridge? And why did so many accounts of the battle contradict one another? The first cracks in the official story came not from officers, but from veterans. In 1919, a group of New Zealand engineers stationed near Hill 60, less than a mile from the Norfolk's final position, gave sworn statements about what they had seen. In testimony recorded by their commanding officer, they described observing a bank of cloud sitting low over the battlefield, separate from the smoke of gunfire. It was thick as wool, one man recalled, and it hung motionless while all other smoke drifted away. They claimed they saw the Norfolks march straight into it and never emerge. When the cloud lifted, the statement continued, there was not a single Englishman to be seen. The account seemed fantastical, even absurd, to the British authorities. Official investigators dismissed it as a trick of light or misremembered trauma. After all, these were men speaking years after a chaotic battle fought in extreme heat under constant shell fire. Memory in war, they argued, is as unreliable as the smoke that veils it. Yet the testimony persisted, passed through veterans' circles, reprinted in obscure military journals, and whispered about in pubs and memorial gatherings across England. Turkish records offered a different, equally puzzling story. In the 1920s, an Ottoman veteran, Captain Ibrahim Sefik, was interviewed by a British historian compiling an unofficial history of the campaign. Sefik recalled no engagement with a full battalion on the date in question. "We saw scattered groups of English advancing," he said, "but not in strength. Those we fired upon fell where they stood. We buried some of them near the ravine, but there was no great battle." His account aligned eerily with the position of the remains found by Captain O'Neill in 1919, but not with the scale of losses reported by the British command. If the Ottomans never encountered the main body of the 1/5, where had the rest gone? The contradictions multiplied. A letter discovered decades later in the archives of the Imperial War Museum, written by a medical officer at Suvla Bay, mentioned the battalion's disappearance with an air of unease. "They went forward in good order and were seen no more," he wrote. "No wounded, no stragglers returned. The ground yielded nothing of them. It was as if the earth itself had opened." Whether he meant this literally or metaphorically, his words captured the growing sense of the uncanny surrounding the event. Back in Norfolk, the mystery became part of local lore. Families who had lost sons and brothers clung to hope long after the official confirmations of death were issued. Rumours flourished, claims that men from the battalion had been sighted in Turkish prison camps, or that they had been transferred secretly to other units. None were ever verified. The Norfolk Regiment's records, when reviewed in the late 1920s, contained no reassignment orders, no surviving prisoners of war, and no correspondence from any captured officer. Their story simply ended on August 12, 1915. Historians in the interwar years began to interpret the event through a new lens. The British military had grown more willing to acknowledge the Gallipoli campaign's failures, its indecision, its poor maps, its disjointed command structure. Some argued that the Norfolks had advanced too far without realizing they had lost flank support. Cut off and surrounded, they may have been annihilated in a sudden Turkish counterattack, their bodies later destroyed by fire or buried by shelling. The problem with that theory, however, was physical evidence, or rather the lack of it. Even the mass grave discovered in 1919 accounted for barely half the missing men. In 1932, journalist Frederick Newman published an article titled "The Mystery of the Vanished Battalion" in the Times. Drawing on interviews with surviving veterans and families, he highlighted inconsistencies in the official reports. "There are ghosts upon that peninsula," he wrote, "not of superstition, but of fact, men unaccounted for, orders unrecorded, truths unspoken." The article reignited public fascination, prompting a brief parliamentary question about the completeness of British war records from Gallipoli. The War Office declined to reopen the investigation, but the public's imagination was not so easily dismissed. By the late 1930s, the vanished battalion had become part of Britain's war folklore, a cautionary tale of bravery, confusion, and the merciless fog of battle. For the families, it was a wound that never quite healed. The names of the missing men, farmers, clerks, gardeners, and officers alike, remained carved into memorials under the phrase, "known unto God." As the clouds of another global conflict gathered on the horizon, a new generation prepared for war, unaware that the enigma of Gallipoli's vanished men still haunted the old soldiers. Their story, tucked away in archives and local memory, had not been forgotten. It waited in the silence of that desolate ridge, in the dust and scrub where no one had yet dared to dig deeper. And in that waiting silence, one question continued to echo through the decades. Was the disappearance of the Norfolk Battalion merely an accident of war, or the deliberate erasure of a military mistake best left buried? By the mid-20th century, the Great War had receded into memory, overshadowed by a new and far greater conflict. Yet for a small group of historians, archaeologists, and descendants, the mystery of the vanished 1/5 Norfolk Battalion refused to rest. As Britain rebuilt in the aftermath of World War II, so too did a quiet determination grow to uncover the truth that official reports had long left obscure. The story of the Sandringham Battalion had become part of the national psyche, its unanswered questions echoing through generations. In 1956, during preparations for a Gallipoli commemoration, Turkish authorities allowed limited archaeological surveys on former battle sites. Among those leading the expedition was British historian and former officer John North, who had served briefly in the Dardanelles campaign. His notes reveal a mixture of military discipline and near-obsessive curiosity. "The land here does not forget," he wrote. "It buries, but it does not erase." Using wartime maps and testimonies, North pinpointed the area described in Captain O'Neill's 1919 report. A narrow ravine running east of Anafata, shaded by low shrubs and crumbling stone terraces. It was here, he believed, that the missing Norfolks had made their final stand. The dig was modest. 3 Turkish workers, a British liaison officer, and North himself. What they uncovered reignited debate. Beneath layers of compacted earth lay clusters of spent 303 rifle cartridges, fragments of webbing, and uniform buttons stamped NF for Norfolk Regiment. Yet what struck North most was the scatter pattern. Tight, disciplined groupings of shell casings, as if fired from defensive positions rather than in advance. These men were not running, he noted. They were fighting. The evidence suggested that the battalion, or part of it, had not vanished in a haze but had dug in and resisted before being overwhelmed. Still, this raised another question. If they fought, where were their enemies? Turkish records from the nearby 36th Regiment mentioned a brief skirmish on August 12th, but one involving only a few dozen English soldiers. No mention of a full battalion appeared in any Ottoman war diary. The disparity persisted. British evidence spoke of hundreds, Turkish accounts only dozens. This contradiction has haunted historians ever since. In 1965, the British Ministry of Defence declassified several Gallipoli-era communications, including one from General Stopford's headquarters that had been overlooked for decades. The message, dated the evening of August 12, 1915, read, 1-5, Norfolk's advanced too far, beyond right flank. Communication lost. No support available. The terse acknowledgement of a breakdown in command coordination confirmed what many had long suspected, that the battalion had likely been sacrificed to the confusion of an uncoordinated assault. But the next line of the report hinted at something more troubling. Advance not authorized beyond point 212B. The location of O'Neill's 1919 discovery lay almost exactly at that point. Had the 1/5 Norfolks advanced under a mistaken order, or, worse, been ordered forward to cover a retreat? A move later buried in bureaucratic silence. The question lingered as new expeditions returned to Gallipoli throughout the 1970s and 80s. British and Turkish archaeologists, aided by ground-penetrating radar, identified more mass graves in the Anafarta sector. Though the remains were treated with respect and reinterred under Commonwealth War Graves Commission oversight, identification proved nearly impossible. Soil acidity and the passage of time had erased names, ranks, and even regiment markings. DNA testing, still in its infancy, could not match the fallen to their descendants. The men remained nameless, but the mystery persisted in their silence. By the late 20th century, historians began to view the Norfolk disappearance as emblematic of the broader tragedy of Gallipoli, an operation marked by bravery, confusion, and human cost. Military scholar Peter Hart later wrote, "The Norfolks did not vanish into thin air, they vanished into chaos." His research, cross-referencing Ottoman and British after-action reports, suggested that many of the missing had likely been killed in isolated pockets of fighting and their bodies concealed by subsequent bombardments and landslides. Yet even Hart admitted that the complete absence of Ottoman prisoner records and eyewitness corroboration remained an uncomfortable void. Meanwhile, descendants of the fallen men continued to search. In 1998, members of the Sandringham estate visited Gallipoli for a centennial commemoration. Among them was historian and local vicar Reverend David Green, whose great-uncle had marched with the 1/5. Standing over the dry ravines, he remarked, "If the earth could speak, it would tell us the truth. But perhaps it chooses silence to spare us from what we'd find." His words captured the emotional weight the story had come to bear. No longer just a military enigma, but a national wound bound up in loss, loyalty, and lingering shame. What had begun as a wartime disappearance had evolved into a question of memory and accountability. Was the battalion's fate obscured by the fog of war, or by deliberate omission? Did commanders, overwhelmed and embarrassed by failure, suppress their own mistakes? Each new document unearthed, each grave uncovered, seemed to bring history no closer to closure. The truth, as one modern historian observed, remained entombed beneath the weight of official silence. And so, the legend of the vanished battalion endures, not merely as a tale of disappearance, but as a mirror reflecting the complexity of war itself, where courage meets confusion, and truth is often the first casualty. Yet even as history books close the chapter, the dry winds that sweep across Gallipoli still whisper through the scrub-covered hills, carrying with them the same question that haunted those who came before. How could an entire battalion march into history, only to vanish from it? More than a century has passed since the sun set on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and the 1/5 Norfolk Battalion disappeared into the haze. Yet their story remains one of the Great War's most enduring enigmas, a tale that straddles the line between history and legend, truth and speculation. Even today, among military historians and battlefield archaeologists, the question persists. What truly happened to the men who marched forward on that August afternoon and never returned? In the decades following the war, official historians tried to distill the chaos of Gallipoli into neat summaries and after-action reports, but the disappearance of the Norfolks resisted such simplification. By the 1980s, a new generation of researchers began revisiting original field notes, war diaries, and Turkish archives, uncovering discrepancies that suggested more than simple confusion. The records of the 163rd Brigade hinted at a breakdown of communication so severe that units fought in isolation, unaware of their own flanks' collapse. The Norfolks, positioned farthest to the right of the British advance, may have pressed forward expecting reinforcements that never arrived. British historian Paul Reed summarised the tragedy succinctly. They advanced into a void of command. That void, where orders faded, maps failed, and courage outpaced coordination, became the battalion's tomb. Modern battlefield analysis has lent weight to this theory. Satellite imagery and topographical surveys conducted in the early 2000s revealed the terrain's deceptive contours. Deep gullies masked by brush, narrow ravines where sound and sight vanished within meters. A battalion advancing through such ground without communication lines intact could easily fragment into scattered groups. Some may have been cut down, others encircled. A few, disoriented, may have wandered miles from their objective, perishing unseen. It is not difficult to imagine how, in the brutal heat and confusion, they could simply disappear. Yet even with these rational explanations, something about the event continues to trouble historians. The Turkish 36th Regiment's war log still makes no mention of an engagement on the exact date or location where the Norfolks vanished. Ottoman casualty figures for that day are minimal. No corresponding battle, no prisoners. The silence on both sides suggests either an erasure of events or a tragedy so chaotic that neither army could record it accurately. For the families who waited in Norfolk's quiet villages, the absence of answers was its own wound. Decades after the war, relatives still wrote to the War Office, asking for clarity. The responses never changed. No further information is available. In time, the battalion's name became less a military unit than a symbol of the forgotten, the mislaid, the uncounted. Their memorial in the Gallipoli Peninsula bears the inscription, "Their name liveth for evermore," but the earth beneath it holds more questions than certainties. In 2015, marking a century since the Gallipoli campaign, a joint British-Turkish archaeological project returned to the Anafarta Ridge. With the aid of ground-penetrating radar and forensic analysis, the team located what may be the last resting place of a portion of the battalion, human remains intermingled with British and Ottoman artifacts. Yet even these findings refused to offer closure. DNA testing could not establish identities. The evidence suggested a desperate final stand. But whether this was the whole battalion or merely fragments of it remains unknown. "We have found them," one researcher remarked, "and yet we have not." The disappearance of the 1/5th Norfolk Battalion now occupies a place in military folklore, often misrepresented, occasionally mythologized, but always magnetic. It captures something elemental about war itself, that amid the precision of plans and the certainty of orders, there exists a vast territory of uncertainty. The fog of battle, literal and metaphorical, can swallow not only men, but meaning. For historians, the case stands as a reminder of how easily truth becomes distorted in the crucible of combat. For descendants, it remains a story of loss and resilience, of men who followed their duty to the last, their courage unrecorded by victory or return. And for the world, the vanished battalion endures as a haunting parable of the unknown, a symbol of every soldier lost to time, buried not just in foreign soil, but in silence. Even now, on certain evenings when the wind shifts across the ridges of Gallipoli, the locals say the air grows thick with heat and dust, and the horizon shimmers in a pale gold haze. It is easy to imagine the outline of men advancing once more through the olive groves, disciplined, determined, and unaware that history is about to erase them. They march still, in memory, if not in body, into the mist of war, into the legend that bears their name. The vanished battalion at Gallipoli, a century-old enigma.